Oh, howdy all, grab yourself a drink, it is time for some Path of Exile discussion. Grinding Gear Games today released patch 3.24.2. This one came a little bit out of left field. I wasn't expecting a major feature patch to come out so quickly in the middle of this existing league. This has a few new Scarabs in it, and as well as that has a very large number of bug fixes. Let's go through some of that, and let's just start with the Scarabs first. 7 Scarabs are being added, 1 Scarab is being changed substantially, and additionally there was the teasing of a Scarab of Unity. That is not going to be added. I think Grinding Gear Games probably couldn't get the balance of reward and risk on that one right, because it was going to add the Valdo exclusive mod, all magic and rare monsters in the zone are in a union of souls, which is one of the most dangerous and honestly ridiculous mods that exists in the Valdo Maps, and I think they decided not to go with it. The interesting thing about a lot of these Scarabs is that they don't really give numbers on what they do, with a couple of exceptions. And that's important because it means that some of these might be much better than they sound, some of these might be much worse than they sound based upon the numbers on them. But anyways, let's go through them, starting with the Abyss Scarab of Profound Depth. Monsters from abysses in area have increased difficulty and reward for each prior pit in that abyss. There's no further information on exactly what this means here. There's a lot of different ways that difficulty can be increased. It can be monsters having damage mitigation, it can be monsters having increased action speed, it can be them having increased damage, or it could be increases to damage projection. They might have increased AoE, increased projectile mechanics like fork or chain. Don't really know exactly what that means. And also increased reward. An increased reward can mean a lot of things too. This could mean a bias towards better loot, it could mean just simply dropping more loot, or it could mean a whole bunch of other things. I don't think it's unreasonable to say this one will take profound testing to find out if it's any good or not. That said, because it's got the Winged Scarab artwork, I'm assuming that this is at least considered to be somewhat special. The Blight Scarab of Invigoration is equally cryptic. Now, empowering towers here include the tier 1, 2, 3 and both tier 4 green towers. Grinding Gear Games have confirmed that this does apply to both green towers. They're going to have increased difficulty and reward, and there's no clarification of what exactly that means. Breach Scarab of Resonant Cascade also has this increased difficulty and reward scaling that's a bit cryptic. Now, breaches in the area open and close 10% faster for each breach that's already opened. This is going to make the biggest procs from the Eve of Destruction node on the Atlas passive tree even better. When you get 10 additional breaches, this one is going to be completely crazy. Additionally, if you're using these, you might want to use Heavy Breach, even though your character might be powerful enough not to want Heavy Breach normally. That's something that's going to need to be tested out. Now we have the Essence Scarab of Adaptation, which also has this increased difficulty and reward aspect on it that isn't quantified, but has quite interesting base text as well. Imprisoned monsters released in areas grant a random essence modifier to another imprisoned monster in the area. This is definitely going to be at its best in conjunction with the Essence Scarab of Calcification. The Legion Scarab of Eternal Conflict is changing. This is now going to gain increased difficulty and reward for each time the monsters are broken out, so this is the one that lets you break monsters out of stasis multiple times. Note that this is an existing Scarab that had a lot of hype around it early, but then interest in it really fell off hard as the league has progressed. Be interesting to see if this can revive that interest, or if this is the final nail in the coffin for that particular Scarab. I'm absolutely certain that Streamer Grimro will do a lot of testing around these, and we'll have some interesting information to report. Scarab of Radiant Storms is next. Now, it's important to note that this is a Resplandant Tempest. There is a Radiating Tempest and there is a Revealing Tempest that have been in the game. Radiating Tempest still in the game, Revealing Tempest is legacy content. These are not what we're getting here, you're getting something else entirely. We're going to have to do some serious testing to work out whether this is a dumpster tier Scarab, an amazing Scarab, or more likely something somewhere in between. The next one is going to call back to affliction mechanics. Scarab of Wisps is going to cause monsters in the area to have a chance to be empowered by 1,000 Wildwood Wisps. Now the keyword here is chance. If that chance is low, then this Scarab is going to be trash. If that chance is medium, then this Scarab is going to be pretty strong. And if it's high, then this Scarab could be very strong indeed. That's going to take testing again to find out exactly what it does. And finally, we have something with the most confusing seeming wording, but it is chosen for a very careful reason. Torment Scarab of Possession. Rare monsters in area have a quarter chance to be possessed by up to 1 tormented spirit. Now, when Grinding Gear Games use the word quarter, they do mean 25%, but it is not a numerical value. This 25% cannot be increased. That's the important thing about the Torment Scarab of Possession. If you have some effect that causes Scarabs on your map to have 40% more effect, then that is still going to stay at 25% rather than being amped up to 35%. Ultimately, I think what they're doing here is making it so that the best use case for this Scarab is less powerful than it might otherwise be. And that means grinding gear games don't have to balance the drop rate of this Scarab around that best case. Instead, they can balance it around a more typical use case. And the people who would put this Scarab to the best use probably aren't interested. They're probably going to use something else instead. Alright, so new Scarabs out of the way, let's discuss the patch notes themselves. Tempest and Affliction Wisps are now considered to be extra content. This means they're no longer going to be present in map areas with the Back to Basics Atlas Keystone allocated. This is a very surgical nerf aimed at top 1% players. This is going to be one of those changes that some people are going to love and some people are going to hate. There's a question that I like to pitch as a bit of a thought experiment here in order to assess the impact of a nerf like this. And that is, what percentage of the most desirable drop anywhere unique items, things like Mage Blood, things like Headhunter, Calandra's Touch and the like, what percentage of these do you want to see drop in the hands of top 1% players? That is, the most efficient players, the people who are running the most juice content. If you answer 99%, if you answer 98%, then you're going to hate this change. If you answer that it should be something like 10 or 20%, then you're going to like this change. Because fundamentally, what this is about is reducing the number of those premium drops that go to people who are running tier 17 maps with back to basics allocated and with extreme methods of juicing in play. This is very much just a few thousand players that are going to be directly nerfed by this, but it's going to have big flow-on effects to people across the entire game. There's no wrong or right answer to that question that I asked about what percentage should drop for each group of players, but grinding gear games are trying to lower the percentage of those items that drop for the top 1%. That is the underlying principle behind all of the 3.24.1 nerfs, and also around this nerf to Back to Basics specifically. I also don't think Back to Basics will survive into patch 3.25. Added 300 more maps to the Valdo's puzzle box drop pool. This will be interesting to see what these are. I'm expecting that these will skew towards rarer items. That was certainly the case with the Voidborn Reliquary key. And if that is indeed the case, then we're going to see Valdo's puzzle boxes become rarer. Of course, I don't know which ones have been added, so I'm only speculating there. It may be that there's a bunch of Valdo's maps for really common uniques like Terminus Est, and if that's the case, then that's going to make Valdo's puzzle boxes more common as a drop. We shall see. Now, in programming, there's a lot of bugs that are really hard to solve. And sometimes the best way to solve a bug is to just change a couple of features around so that that bug never comes up. That's what grinding gear games are doing here to address a long-standing but rare bug where Elder Guardian maps would become bricked, because at the time that the Elder Guardian was pushed under a certain hit point threshold, it was just on the wrong frame of a Delirium ability. In maps that have got Delirium layers applied to them, or where the Delirium mirror is in effect, rare and unique monsters gain a few special abilities they don't otherwise have. For example, a Frozen Flume attack. These could sometimes rarely brick an Elder Guardian transition. Rather than addressing this bug, which has probably been quite slippery and doesn't come up all that often to be an emergency, what grinding gear games are doing is simply removing the ability for these Delirium possessions to apply to the Elder Guardian fights themselves. So the Elder Guardian map can still be delirious, the stat increases that apply with Delirium will still apply to the boss, but they're no longer going to pause their usual attack routine in order to do something like a Delirium Frozen Flume or Bolt Cross. Instead, they're just going to use their own abilities more frequently. I actually think this is going to make delirious Elder Guardians a little bit harder than they were previously, because those Delirium abilities were pretty easy to dodge once you got the hang of them, whereas the baseline abilities of the Elder Guardians, especially amped up with the stat increases that are associated with the Delirium mechanic, were fairly sketchy sometimes. Anyways, the most important thing here is that grinding gear games have decided to fix a long-standing bug. They haven't been able to quite get it down, and so they've made a couple of changes so that that bug will never happen again. There's an Abyss challenge that requires you to defeat Stygian Spires. The intention of this was that it couldn't be bypassed through using the Allflame Ember of Abyss, and grinding gear games are rewording the challenge to clarify that that's the intention. And a quite significant quality of life thing here for Trade League players. If you're searching for a skill gem and you're not interested in its transfigured version, for example, maybe you're looking for a level 21 classic Arc gem, and you keep seeing level 21 Arc of Oscillation coming up instead, which you happen not to be interested in. Well, doing a search for Arc will no longer show those Arc of Oscillations, and that will apply to other gems that might be more popular than Arc as well. Next, there's a whole bunch of bug fixes of varying significance. Firstly, the Eternity Shroud. This is intended to be an uber elder boss drop. It was not dropping at all, and this is now being rectified. The Eternity Shroud is a perfect example of an item that really has been power crept out of relevance. This was incredible when it was added to the game in patch 3.6, but there's been so many more and more powerful items added since that the Eternity Shroud no longer really feels like an endgame item, and it puts a lot of demands on your character and ends up being really difficult to build around as a result. I honestly would like to see the numbers on this changed. If the 3 to 5% roll range on this item was changed to a flat 7%, I think it might actually be a really interesting item again, but for the moment, I don't think this is going to matter much. And really, this is just going to pollute the drop table for Uber Elder. Not that there's all that much in there that people are that interested in. Next is a bug that I hadn't noticed because I just assumed that my loot filter was hiding all of these drops anyway. Monster packs from Allflame members that caused influenced items to drop were not dropping influence items. I assumed they were dropping and that my loot filter wasn't showing them. It's part of the deal with Necropolis League, with the crafting being so incredibly strong in this league. Something that's not a finished item just isn't really loot at all, and so people are hiding more influenced items than ever before, and it had been the meta for a while that the classic influence types weren't particularly good. I do think though there is one game mode where this bug fix is going to have more of an impact than it will for others, and that is in solo self-found. If you're playing in solo self-found, you can't just trade with someone that's got Cyrus on farm and get an item level 86 of any particular base that you want with any particular Elder Slayer influence that you want, nor can you trade with someone that's got the Shaper on farm and get an item level 86, for example, Shaper influence Titanium Spirit Shield. Instead, you're going to need to find those things yourself, and these Allflame Ember packs are going to be one solution for doing that. Especially for the Elder Slayer influences, where getting the right Elder Slayer influence map type is somewhat rarer. Next is a number of really minor bugs that don't come up very often. So strongboxes could sometimes brick, not very often but sometimes, in tier 17 maps that had Runes of the Searing Exarch present. The Torment Spirit Rogue Exile one we'll come back to in a sec. Fixed a bug that caused some Necropolis corpses to be unable to be collected. I personally haven't seen this and I've collected more than 1,000 Necropolis corpses in this league, probably closer to 2,000. And fixed a bug where the Scarab of Calcification could work on monsters that were not part of the baseline map. For example, monsters in Betrayal Research Encounters, which is fairly corner case. But I want to come back to the one we skipped over here, which is another one of those back to basics things. Back to Basics was bugged in a way that favoured players who were using it, which is something that was widening the gap between those top 1% players that can handle such a lethal keystone as Back to Basics and the rest of the player base. So this is removing some of those Tormented Spirits and Rogue Exiles that shouldn't have been there. Fix the bug where Nullify prefixes and Nullify suffixes were not options with the Horned Scarab of Awakening. This one that I think would have come up more if the tier 17 maps hadn't been nerfed back in week 1 of the league, but since those nerfs had taken place, it doesn't really matter all that much most of the time. The Horned Scarab of Awakening is generally too precious to use on these Nullify crafts, and that means that this isn't really going to make much of a difference. There's just generally better uses for that Scarab. Vaal Grace had a significant bug on it. This is a gem that people haven't been using all that much for a while. It has been used, but not as much as it probably deserves. The intended effect of Vaal Grace is that spell damage you suppress is unlucky, but the effect was all spell damage dealt to you is unlucky. The reason this hadn't really mattered that much is that Vaal Grace isn't that popular to use, and on top of that, Vaal Grace is something that people probably won't set up until after they've got suppression capped, or at least they've come very, very close to being suppression capped. That said, it is a powerful effect and it will make you much tankier while it's up. It's just, of course, something that's unsustainable being a Vaal skill and all. There's another change that's being made to the triggered Detonate Mines skill that's granted by Detonate Mines are triggered when you're moving passive skill mastery. I have to check with someone that's playing Mines this league as to exactly what this is going to mean for them. There's a couple of fixes to obscure situations involving Scarabs, and then we have something that I got fixed. Fixed a bug where no magic or rare items drop Private League modifier applied to tier 17 maps. This one was important for grinding your games to fix. I think it's really important that Private League mods can't make the game easier in any way, and even though I don't think that this was making the game easier, it skirted close enough to that line that grinding your games have made the right choice in fixing it here. And finally, there's a number of much smaller changes here that aren't really as significant. Anyways, this is a fairly big patch, most notably because of the new Scarabs, something grinding your games don't necessarily add in the middle of a league all that often, and all of these will be interesting things to explore over the next couple of weeks. I do think it'll take a little while, maybe 3 or 4 days, for people to solve which of these are the best. I'm definitely interested in playing around with the Abyss Scarab of Profound Depth when I go back over into the main trade league after my private league finishes, and potentially even beforehand. Anyways, I'm keen to know which of these Scarabs, if any, jump out to you as particularly interesting. Leave your answers to that one down in the comments below. Otherwise, I'm going to leave it there. May your Vaal Orbs have interesting results.